Okay, hello everyone. For this lesson today, we're going to look at uh, the bonus army. Okay, our objectives and standards to summarize the requests of the bonus army and to analyze the response to the bonus army by the federal government and the military. And of course, as usual, we have our standards here again. Okay, vocabulary preview. For this lesson, I want you to focus on the word the bonus army. And just look at this picture and think about this. What do you see in this picture, and what can you read on the signs, and what can you possibly gather from this picture about the bonus, or maybe what they were looking for or requesting, or anything else you may pick out of the picture that's important that may lead you to understand what we're going to be talking about for this lesson. Okay, on our central question, what was the impact of the bonus army? Okay, so the Patman Bill. So after World War I, when veterans came home, they were promised in 1924 that they would be granted cash and life insurance for their service in the military during the war. Um, Now, what happens is with the Great Depression onsetting and coming about, there's a congressman by the name of Wright Patman who pushed for veterans of World War I to be paid for their service immediately. Obviously, people are suffering and a lot of families are suffering, so Mr. Patman pushes for the benefits to be pushed up a little bit because, this is okay, so the March of the Bonus Army. So, led by Walter Walters, uh, World War I veterans came to Washington, D.C. from across the country to build support for the Patman Bill, this idea of the veterans being paid early. Now, they're going to call themselves the Bonus Army, and it's called the March of the Bonus Army because, of course, they came from all across the country to get here. President Hoover disagreed with the veterans, but he's going to allow them to stay on Capitol grounds and even established we looked at earlier this week, a shanty town, these little huts or things like that for the veterans and their families to stay in on Capitol grounds, and he provides them with food and shelter. So he says they can stay as long as they remain peaceful. They have a right to be there. They have a right to, make their voices heard about their support for the bill, but they need to, remain peaceful, obviously. Here's some pictures of what the Bonus Army's shantytown looked like. You can see a picture here on the left-hand side, American flag, and some little huts and things like that, and some of the veterans and things like that. And then here they are in front of a building. You can see some signs in the background. And again, this was a huge event. This was a lot of veterans came to this to, see what they could do to see if they could get Congress to give them their benefits early. And then down here in the corner, the small picture, this is Walter Walters, the man who was somewhat in charge of this movement of the Bonus Army. Unfortunately, the Senate is going to vote down the Patman Bill. And with that said, Hoover requested that the veterans return to their homes. He says, listen, it's over. Go home, go back to, your way of life and things like that. And many of the veterans do. Many of them do leave and go home. But around 2,000 of them are going to still stay. And they hope to meet with President Hoover to discuss their requests. They hope that maybe he'll hear them out, and maybe he'll push Congress to make a change. But again, Hoover was not in favor of making a change to their benefits or pushing the date up, so their request is pretty much going to be denied. As the Bonus Army and these veterans and their families stay longer and longer, President Hoover becomes nervous that these groups of veterans could become possibly violent. Now, they hadn't really shown too much of that, but he becomes nervous that they might show, some signs of it. So he orders a military force of about 1,000 soldiers to disband or get rid of the group. So under the command of General Douglas MacArthur and his assistant, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, which their two names will come up later in our course as well, so if you can try to remember their names, the military is going to forcibly remove these veterans and their families. Now remember, these are veterans who are there with their wives and children, some of them very young children. So, and they're going to remove them by force. And also during the removal, they're going to use gas, like just the way we kind of talked about in World War I. They're going to use gas, and I believe an 11-month-old baby was actually killed during the removal, and 2 people were actually shot as well. So it was a pretty violent removal. They actually burned the shanty towns and roughed people up and things like that. So it was not an easy removal. So of course, like I was saying, because it was such a forcibly removed event, Americans were shocked at the treatment of these veterans who had fought in World War I and suffered already, and were still suffering. So many Americans were shocked and appalled at the treatment of these veterans and their families. So with that said, Hoover and his approval rating with the public is going to drop even further. Hoover already has a low approval rating because of how he's handling the economic crisis. So this is going to make Hoover look even worse because he's roughing up veterans. So obviously that doesn't go over too well. And also, Hoover has the election of 1932 coming up, and he's up for re-election. He's planning on running again. But because of the economic crisis and his treatment of the veterans during the bonus army, it's going to make a tough fight for him in the upcoming election, and he's already going to go up against a very popular governor of New York, and some of you may recognize this man's name already, but a man by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a very popular governor of New York already, and so Hoover has a lot of things going against him with the economic crisis, his treatment of the veterans during the bonus army march, and also now going up against somebody who was very popular and things like that. Okay, just to wrap up. So the Patman Bill pushed for veterans to be paid early for their benefits and their money, and the bonus army is going to march to Washington, D.C. All these veterans and their families from World War I are going to come to the Capitol to gain support for the bill and try and push Congress to pass it, but it is going to be denied. President Hoover asked that these veterans and their families return home. Some of them do, others do not. And as they stay, Hoover becomes nervous. They could become violent or other things like that. So he asked that the military, under Douglas MacArthur and his assistant Dwight D. Eisenhower, get a military force together and remove the bonus army by force. And during the removal, like I said, I believe a baby was killed and people are injured and they're roughed up and they're gassed and 2 people were shot. So Americans are just shocked and appalled that the government and the military would do this to the veterans and their families. And as an outcome of that, Hoover and his approval with the American people is going to further decrease, and it's going to give FDR, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his picture there, an advantage in the upcoming election of 1932. Okay, so that's all I have for today. So again, just make sure you do the questions, and I will see or talk to you soon.